The Science Behind the Makings of a Monster, a presentation by Olivia Cooley. Why should I apologize for the monster I have become? No one ever apologized for making me this way. The Joker. The Joker is a highly neglected villain in the Batman series who even confesses to his being a monster. Not only does he confess to the monstrosity he has become, he mentions that he was made this way. This idea is eerily connected to two fictional stories that focus on two characters that become monsters through strange, grotesque processes. The first such story is written by Mary Shelley and follows the creation and horrid life led by one of the main characters. This work is entitled Frankenstein. The second piece, written by Robert Louis Stevenson, follows the transformation of a seemingly regal and official fellow into the brute that is supposedly hidden by the mask his creator wears. This piece is entitled The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These stories, along with the Batman series, present monsters who terrorize humanity. But if the Joker is correct in saying that he was made into a monster, these stories also beg reality and mankind to identify how a monster is truly formed. Despite Shelley's and Stevenson's creations being essentially human in physicality and mentality, the way they are interacted with and the science that created them has made them monsters. But whether or not they are truly evil is for the thoughts of the beholder to determine. The beginning of such a claim must begin with what a monster is truly defined as. Google defines a monster to be, quote, an imaginary creature that is typically large, ugly, and frightening, end quote. Therefore, the term monster is based solely on the physicality of a creature, not on the mentality or personality. If a monster begins in physicality, then that is where I, too, will begin. Physicality is our first impression. It tells a story and gives personality context. It is how people carry themselves, what others see in an individual's eyes, what they feel in a handshake, and the story to be told in the facial expressions all bear. Posture is one of the biggest indicators of mood, confidence, and desires because it displays what the entire body desires and feels. If this is the case, it is no surprise that the postures both creatures maintain are slumped, as the postures of a broken, saddened individual often are. Victor Frankenstein's initial rejection and lack of love towards his creation forced his monster into a life of sadness, a life on the run. Later on, his monster is once more rejected by the Lacys and felt, quote, my heart sank within me as with bitter sickness, and the general tumult escaped unperceived to my hovel. End quote. Page 50 of Frankenstein. Although not directly given, the posture of Frankenstein's creation is visible. When one experiences sickness, they are often curled up and hunched, which is similar to the shriveled and upset nature brought by tumult. The creation escaped unperceived because the sting of rejection changed his physicality and forced sadness into his posture. The slumped and hunched posture of Frankenstein's creation is very like to the posture of Hyde, because Hyde experienced the same rejection for such a length of time that he is, in actuality, quote, so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. End quote. Page 45 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It can be assumed that the posture of Hyde drastically differs from that of Jekyll because of the time at which Jekyll rejected Hyde. His youth or young adulthood. It can be assumed that the posture of Hyde drastically differs from that of Jekyll because of the time at which Jekyll rejected Hyde, his youth or young adulthood. Therefore, if both creatures were rejected by the creators, forced into solitude, and changed physically, it can only have been caused by their rejection, or rather their creator's lack of love for what they had created. A lack of love can have numerous effects, but the most common reaction is a need for attention. To gain attention, the victim generally engages in negative behavior, enacts revenge, or attempts to make another jealous. In Shelley's and Stevenson's stories, the creations choose acts of revenge to force the pain of unhappiness and a lack of love onto those who first presented it to them. The terrible deaths that follow occur at the hands of the creations that long for revenge on the creators. And in doing so, the creations present themselves as monstrous because they have bloodied their hands. The first acts to come from Frankenstein's monster's hands are acts of kindness and curiosity in hopes of obtaining affection and understanding of the world. Even after rejection, he assisted the Lacys. Quote, I often took his tools and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days. End quote. Page 41 of Frankenstein. Although he took the tools, they were always returned and under the care of Frankenstein's creation. The Lacys were supplied with wood. It isn't until after the Lacys' rejection that the creation realizes that no one has a desire to love him. Afterwards, the monster burns the Lacys' home, exposing the start to a crueler creation and his need for revenge. Going back to his roots, the creation attempts at reparation with his creator, but to no avail. This tertiary rejection inspires the forming of a true monster. Quote, I grasped his throat to silence him, and in a moment he lay dead at my feet. End quote, page 53 of Frankenstein. Quote, he had apparently been strangled, the black mark of fingers on his neck. End quote, page 67 of Frankenstein. She was there, lifeless and inanimate, her head hanging down. End quote, page 75 of Frankenstein. All three examples exemplify the brutality of the newly formed monster. Of course, it is evident that Frankenstein's creation wanted to see the victim struggle and die slowly to cause immense suffering. Quote, grasped his throat, end quote, quote, strangled fingers on his neck, end quote, quote, head hanging, end quote. Strangling is a very slow and ineffective way to kill, not to mention that it leaves a mark and is reckless. By using this method of killing, the monster expresses its need to see the life drain from his victim's eyes and let Victor know that it was his doing to ensure maximum pain and attention gain. Hyde's violence is evidence of nearly the same thing, as he takes no care to hide his doings. In the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, Hyde clubbed his victim and, quote, was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, end quote, page 15 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Hyde's brutality was not only witnessed by a maid, but he killed Sir Danvers under a bright moon, which would allow passerby to see the killing clearly. Furthermore, this too is an inefficient way to kill, clubbing, trampling, and hailing down blows. Due to this barbarity, Hyde makes it clear that he was killing for fun and that he wasn't going to hide his wants. Both creations ensued savage killings upon the world, and both used their own hands to do so, strangling and beating. The start of such atrocity was a lack of love, which led to a need for attention, executed in violent killings, turning creation evil at the hands of itself. Finally, the place where the majority of what I've addressed is given shape, the face. The faces of both creations are unique, but very similar. After all, when multiple people picture a monster, the image that appears are similar because of certain traits seen in monsters. Although the specific image is not given, a quick survey of students confirmed that yellowed flesh, a sunken face, and a prominent brow ridge are what was generally pictured. In order to determine the meanings of such characteristics, extensive research was performed. The first trait, yellowed flesh, has multiple causes and diseases associated with it. However, the most notable causes affected the liver, red blood cell count, and exposure to toxins. Of these, an exposure to toxins seemed most probable, and the proper term for this is cirrhosis. This is most likely because Victor's creation was exposed to massive amounts of chemicals and procedures that could have easily caused such an illness. On the other hand, Hyde would display such a trait because of the chemicals and the very tonic that transformed Jekyll into Hyde. Most other monsters are physically pictured this way, and with reason, as the majority of a monster's tales involve creation. Second, the sunkenness of the face simply implies a lack of life and a fading of emotion as one ages. This makes sense, as one creation was engineered over a length of time with aged body parts, while the other was pent up for ages. The final trait, the eyebrow ridge, is probably the most common of these three, as monsters are generally associated with underdevelopment and a lack of knowledge. In modern culture, such an eyebrow ridge is associated with an early human form, the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal had a short lifespan and a thick skull to protect the brain from harmful blows and damage that might be encountered. However, this eyebrow ridge also caused a lack of peripheral vision, as in some unfortunate cases it would block some of the normally visible area. With a possibility of cirrhosis, a lack of life, and underdevelopment, the form of these creations, or rather monsters, could be considered poor science, or an overreach in science. The physical defects suffered can be linked to the creation's rejection because of its horrendous appearance, the initial thing that defines a monster. However, the mentality of both creations also has an effect on the final product and decision, as the actions and reactions of the monster in relation to its physicality cannot start in the posture, the hands, or the facial expressions. These must all be linked back to the brain's perception of the situation, and therefore, can something be a monster if its brain is not considered a part of the final decision? Perception, maturity, and decision-making development and growth all occur in the brain, held inside the rest of the body as it too develops. In Shelley's case, the brain of Frankenstein's monster must have come from where the rest of the body came from, scavenging. If this is the case, then the brain housed by the creature's body must have been kept in some sort of stasis until Victor had developed his creature enough so that its body could support a brain. However, keeping a brain in stasis is still rare today, and is only done to the brain of guinea pigs, as it can endanger the memory and life of the brain. Of course, doing something this complex in the 18th century would be a ridiculous scientific overreach, as not only would the brain be stolen, but it would be damaged and used in what was supposed to be near to human. This is exemplified in Victor's creation's lack of knowledge of the previous owner and the ideas this brain formulates. While Victor's creation was occupying the hovel, he thinks of his beginning, but, quote, all my life was now a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing, end quote, page 45 of Frankenstein. If it is true that his past is a blot and a blind vacancy, it can be determined that the brain did not maintain knowledge of the previous owner during the transfer. The lack of memory perfectly displays the overreach that occurred. One should not be able to erase a brain or transfer it and its memories in the first place. Hyde's situation is opposite to this one, as Hyde maintains the knowledge of his other self, Dr. Jekyll. With this the case, Hyde must also know the easiest way to kill someone or hurt another, but he still beats his victims out of rage and need for attention. In fact, it appears that Hyde enjoys killing and harming others over the slightest misunderstandings, similar to a child's reaction, actually. Not that many children kill, but violence and screaming is often the choice to get what they want. In fact, this kind of reaction relates to the brain development of a child. Therefore, it can be presumed that despite maintaining proper knowledge, the brain of Hyde, and the body too, are underdeveloped and incapable of problem solving. The thought of being able to change development and quality of one's brain is blood-curdling, and a science that violates the laws of science itself is an overreach without equal. Meanwhile, the brain development of Victor's creation was stunted in stasis, and this is best expressed in the creation's single-mindedness and solutions. When confronted with rejection, Victor's creation, quote, vowed eternal hatred and vengeance, end quote, page 53 of Frankenstein, towards Victor and all mankind. The want for vengeance and appeasement of hatred led Victor's creation to a single solution, and the mentioned vow portrays the sealing of fate, death, to Victor's family, and to Victor himself. This single-sided solution is equivalent to the development of a middle school child, and therefore also clearly illuminates the defects the brain suffered in transfer. The brains of both Victor's creation and Hyde are so damaged by the science used to unleash them that they are then crippled by such defects and forced to use emotion as their only outlet for wants and needs. This outlet gives insight into their minds and their underdevelopment, depicting the scientific overreach that led to such crippling defects. It is possible that without the defects, both creations could have succeeded without violence and a need for vengeance over the interaction they had with their creators. Quote, an imaginary creature that is typically large, ugly, and frightening, end quote. This is what defines a monster, and it points to physicality which leaves tracks in the mentality of such a creation. Therefore, the physicality and mentality of the creations in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are what lead to the answer of, are one or both of these creations truly a monster? It is evident that their interactions with their creators led to their need for revenge. For Victor's creation, it was rejection. For Hyde, it was his being suppressed. Not only did both creators' lack of love lead to this revenge, but the defects found in the scientific overreaches used to create them forced a flawed decision-making process on both creations. Therefore, if it is the creator's fault for making creatures that were flawed, resulting in rejection and a need for revenge, then can the creations truly be defined as monsters? Well, if you're waiting for an answer, I don't have one. I am not the judge of life, and it is not my right to decide what defines a monster, and nor is Google's. So what do you think? Is the Joker right in placing the blame on the perpetrator, or should the victims who act on this be blamed for their actions? Even then, don't we all have a monster inside of us? Victor had a mad scientist that created catastrophe and a threat, while Jekyll had Hyde. Furthermore, little things can set us all off. and cause us to do things we regret. Doesn't that too count as a monster? The Joker once said, quote, "Monsters don't sleep under your bed. They sleep in your mind." End quote. So who are we to judge if there is a monster in us all? Final information for this presentation. No copyright infringement intended within this presentation. All images and references were used purely for educational purposes under the laws of fair use in schools. Should any images in this presentation be owned by anyone who views this video, contact me at olivia.cooley@yahoo.com and I will remove, change, or cite the image sources in this presentation. This presentation features information from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Dreisbach, Honors English 2, Period 1, June 11th of 2017. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you learned something about what it truly means to be a monster and how they are created.